It's always a pleasure to be here with you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the African Podcast TV. This podcast is about Africa, regarding the political side, the historical side, the cultural side, so many more. Each week, I deliver my best thought and analysis regarding Africa. Here are my guests, Joe Siegle. He's the director of Research African Center for Studies and National Defense University. Thank you so much, sir, for joining me this weekend on African Podcast TV.
It's my pleasure, Amadou. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. So let's talk about the Research African Center for Studies. First of all, so can you tell us more about that? What is that exactly? How that has been impacting the some African countries or the African community?
Well, the Africa Center for Strategic Studies is it's a Washington-based think tank um, uh, sponsored by the Department of Defense, and it was set up over 20 years ago to help facilitate research, deepening understanding, and the facilitation of exchange of views between Africa and the United States on Africa security issues. And there was a sense that there isn't enough research and study of Africa and Africa's security. And without that research and understanding, we can't really address any of the problems very effectively, and there can't be cooperation. So the center was set up to try to facilitate those sorts of exchanges, and we continue to do so today.
Okay, good. So let's talk about democratization in Africa. So first of all, so how do you see democracy in Africa, and do you think democracy is in threat in the continent, especially when you see the last 2 years, for example, what's happened to Chad? You see that the coup, and then after that, what's happened to Mali, and after that, what's happened to Guinea, and so how do you think about that? How do you see democracy in Africa now?
Well, I think democracy is under stress right now in Africa. Um, you know, since the early 1990s, we saw a very steady and widespread improvement in the quality of democracy, more openness, more political participation, more freedom of expression across many African countries. That's not to say that every country reached a level of full democracy, but there was a lot more openness. Um, Over the last decade, that has sort of plateaued as we've seen more pushback and some stagnation in the creation of democratic institutions, especially checks and balances. And over the last 2 years, as you indicate, we've seen a significant decline. And so really, as a result of the coups, as a result of leaders evading term limits and staying on power for longer periods of time, we now, for the first time in more than a decade in Africa, there are more African governments that are autocratic leaning than democratic leaning. So it is an important step backward.
Mhm.
And it's important because democracies aren't just good, good to have. They're not just, better forms of government and more respect of human rights, but democracies tend to do a better job of upholding the rule of law. They have a much stronger development track record and economic growth, and they do a better job of avoiding conflicts and minimizing some of the humanitarian consequences of that. So there are some really important implications from this democratic backsliding that we're seeing.
Let's talk about that because actually, as someone who has been studying especially about Africa, I haven't seen this since back in the days. So can you think that some leaders are the cause of those coups? Why coups are coming back in Africa?
Well, it's a really good question, and one we all want to be thinking about more right now. I think there's several reasons. Um, I would start by saying that over the last few years, we've seen African militaries becoming much more politicized. And whereas over the previous 20 years, there was a growing understanding that military should be apolitical. They should get out of politics because, you know, before that, Africa had many military governments, and they did a terrible job of government. There was great levels of corruption, stagnating development, a lot of human rights abuses, huge debts, a lot of and other serious flaws, and we should say and conflict and violence. And so it was that experience that pushed Africa not only towards more democracy, but to bar militaries from having any political role. And that was increasingly accepted until the last few years. We've been seeing some militaries growing closer to political parties, and sometimes it's the political parties that are growing closer to the military as a way of trying to stay in power for longer periods of time. And so it's becoming increasingly accepted that the military has a role, and as some military leaders come to enjoy that special relationship, they don't want to leave it up. And some have economic interest that they're able to realize from those close relationships, and so they're attracted, they're seduced by the power that it can bring. So I think that's the first thing. I would throw out an issue of term limits too, that we've seen a deterioration of term limits in the last several years, especially. And so as leaders stay in power longer, it negates other ways of changing.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you get into it much better again, talking about the military? Because some people think that military will bring change, and some people don't think that, because as you said, we have been seeing some countries where the military will take the power, but it's not as well as if the civilian take the powers. It's a lot of things is not going the way it's supposed to be. So please, can you get into it much better?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And it's a good point, Amadou, because the average age of African today is about 19 years old. And so many young Africans don't remember the experience when we had all these military governments in Africa. They don't remember all the corruption and the human rights abuses and the lawlessness and the terrible economic track record, and which has contributed to Africa being poor in many cases today. And it took a lot of effort to move past that. In its fundamental sense, militaries are there for protection. They're not there to govern. They're not trained for that. They don't have the popular legitimacy to do that. They don't have the training. Now, some people might argue, well, some civilian leaders haven't done very well. Either there's corruption, and patronage and other problems. We have security problems. Maybe the military can do a better job. And what I say to that is, you have to be careful what you hope for, because when a military comes in, and especially when they come in through a coup, you're not only changing the leadership, you're basically throwing away your constitution and your democratic checks and balances and the rights of citizens to choose your government. And so when you have a coup, it's up to the leader, it's up to the coup leader then to decide how things are going to proceed. You've thrown away your basic democratic rights and protections. And so democracies have many flaws. They're not perfect, but the saving grace for democracies are that they're self-correcting. They can change. The people can change the government, and they can protest. They can call for a different way of doing things. They can vote out their leaders. And I think that's the key message, that if you're not happy with your leaders, then change them legally. But if you get into this mode of changing leaders through coups, then it sets you down a very slippery slope, because if you accept one coup, then why don't you accept the next one? If one group of colonels decides that they want to take power because they're not happy with the government, then what's to stop the next group of colonels in another couple of months from saying, well, we're not happy with that government? And so it becomes a self-perpetuating process. And in fact, that's what happened in the past. Countries that have one coup tend to have a second coup and then a third coup. And it goes on. And it creates a lot of instability in the country. And so it's really important that now that so many African countries have set up democratic constitutions, that we stick to them. And we look at the ways that you change leaders and that you uphold the rule of law.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
Again, it's not that
Yes.
democracies don't have problems. It's just about how do you change them.
Okay. So, like you said, democracy doesn't have a problem. Just how you change them. But if you see some countries in Africa again, you see what's happened to again in Guinea and in Cote d'Ivoire. After the two terms, those presidents don't wanna give the power to someone else. They just try to change the rule of the law or the laws just to have more power again and then to bring another term. So you see that happening, for example, in Guinea again. Because in my opinion, that if the president did not change the constitution, that will never going to happen. Because according to the military, anytime they take over the power, they have the same argument. It's because of corruption, because of this, because of the government is not taking care of the people. So now we are here to do different things like taking care of the people. So what do you think about that? Do you think the civilians should change their strategy more, respecting the constitution, respecting the rule of the law?
I think we're talking. Well, certainly, civilians should respect the rule of law, and they have to uphold the law. I mean, that is what democracy is about. Nobody is above the law. But I think we're talking about two separate things, both of which need attention. And I have done a lot of writing about the importance of term limits in Africa. And this is one of the most important steps for establishing checks and balances. I talked about the history of military governments, but we also have a history of big man governments in Africa, civilians or former military who stay in power indefinitely. They're presidents for life.
Mm-hmm.
And we have seen that after two terms, leaders tend to exhibit higher levels of corruption, slower levels of economic growth, higher levels of conflict in their country. So, people who stay in power after their designated terms, and almost always that requires some sort of extra constitutional action to avoid the term limits. They're acting in increasingly extra legal manners so they can stay in power. And interestingly, the popularity of these leaders goes down over time. It's not going up. It's not like they're staying in power because of popular demand. And so in the end, leaders are staying in power because they want to stay in power for their own benefit and the benefit of their networks, their parties, and those who benefit from them being in power. And so it's really important. A lot of reformers in Africa over the years have worked hard to create these term limits. And it's really important that these be maintained, because if not, we're going to see this return of a norm of presidents for life. And indeed, today, we have over 10 African leaders who've been in power for more than 20 years. And others, and since since 2015, we've seen 13 African leaders evade term limits. So it means they've been in power for more than two terms. So that is going to just perpetuate the problem. So certainly getting civilians to recognize and uphold term limits is extremely important. That needs to be supported by the judiciaries in these countries. The citizens need to be clear about their expectations, and the regional actors, ECOWAS, the African Union, others, they need to reinforce these messages, as does international communities. So absolutely, there's need for action on both the part of civilians respecting term limits and on the part of the militaries not to intervene in politics.
Okay, let's talk about the ECOWAS because you just mentioned the ECOWAS. I would like to talk about the ECOWAS because we haven't seen what they're doing. So, do you think that is a double standard? If you see now Alassane Ouattara from Cote d'Ivoire, who bring the third, who already have another term again. That's the third terms, and then he went to Guinea just to try to negotiate. And then if you see that, and then when Alpha Conde was trying to do the third terms, people have been calling the ECOWAS to do something. They did nothing. And then now, after the coup, they went to Guinea, and that's the same thing happened to Mali too. So, do you think they have a double standard?
Well, I think we need to look at this in a long-term perspective. ECOWAS has been a leader within Africa in trying to establish good governance norms and prohibiting coups and trying to bring stability. And, in fact, this November will mark the 20th anniversary of the ECOWAS protocol on good governance and democracy, which sets out a series of principles and standards for the region. And during most of that time, ECOWAS has done a good job of, in my view, of trying to encourage those norms. And just a couple of years ago, 14 of the 15 ECOWAS member states were democratically leaning. Now, over the last few years, ECOWAS has not been as consistent in upholding democratic norms. And they've been willing to compromise and recognize leaders who stayed in power through questionable means. And by that, I mean, altering constitutions so they can stay in power past their term limits. And I think that has often been rationalized by the sense, well, these are incumbents and, they must be popular, and if, and at least it'll bring stability. And yet, the evidence shows that the longer leaders stay in power, actually, the more unstable their countries become.
Okay.
And so by accepting extra legal actions on the part of some of these leaders, ECOWAS is now facing a bigger problem where you have a waterfall of extra legal actions, let's say, that are really undermining the norms for the region. And so that's held with the coups in Mali, and then in Guinea, and yes, and not respecting the need for term limits in Togo. You mentioned Cote d'Ivoire and in Guinea, and so yes, I think ECOWAS can do more, and I think they're realizing now, as they see this this surge in the number of coups that we're experiencing in West Africa, that they need to take a stronger stand.
Definitely, that's definitely my point. The ECOWAS, they definitely have to do more because nowadays, especially in Africa, especially the young, especially the youth, they do not trust the ECOWAS. Seeing what's happened to Cote d'Ivoire again, seeing what's happened to Mali, seeing what's happened to Guinea, the ECOWAS have been working with them. So, in your knowledge, how do you think the ECOWAS will do to bring trust to the organization, especially the youth or the people in the African people will trust again the ECOWAS? Because now they do not trust the ECOWAS. I'm not gonna say 100%, but if you look at that, like 80% do not trust the ECOWAS. So how do you think the ECOWAS can build trust again?
Well, I think there's several things that ECOWAS can do. And one is they should not be recognizing these coup leaders. And, two, they need to take a more active and involved role in trying to facilitate the transition back to democracy. I think one of the mistakes we've seen in Guinea and Mali has been that ECOWAS has left it up to the military governments to organize the transition.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, neither of those governments actually wants to leave power, and they have no incentive to organize those elections. So I think ECOWAS needs to be more actively involved, and they need to put pressure. And so by putting pressure, I mean sanctioning those leaders, restricting the bank accounts of some of the Ministry of Finance and central banks of these countries, so that these military juntas can't tap them and use them for their own political interest relative to the interest of their countries. And so I think ECOWAS has to be a guarantor of the transitions now that these coups have happened. But ECOWAS could do better ahead of time when we do see these term limit evasions. Again, they should be talking to these leaders ahead of time,
Mm-hmm.
signaling that they will not be recognized, that they're not going to be accepted, they won't be in good standing. And then they have to follow through with action. And I think it's important to realize, some people say, well, ECOWAS is just, a regional body. It doesn't have an army. What power does it have? But it has an important power of persuasion and of coordination. If ECOWAS is taking a strong stand, the international community will also come in behind it. But if ECOWAS is not taking a strong stand, it's hard for the international community to come in alongside it. And so I think ECOWAS needs to take a high road. It needs to take a principled road to achieve these objectives.
Good.
And I think you mentioned the trust with the population. I think this is a really important point, that in a democracy, you have freedom of expression, and people have a vote, people have a voice. And so it isn't just about waiting for ECOWAS. Here's where citizens throughout West Africa need to be making more demands of ECOWAS. If there's popular pressure for ECOWAS to uphold these norms, uphold legality, constitutionality in these governments, then that becomes a norm, that becomes an expectation for other countries in West Africa.
Good.
So I would, encourage citizens in West Africa to have make their voices known to ECOWAS, and with that popular support, it gives them more influence, gives them more leverage when they're dealing with these military juntas or leaders who are trying to evade their trying to sustain or prolong their times in office.
Good. So, in your knowledge, what are the steps to take to avoid coup in Africa?
Well, Africa was doing really well for quite some time in reducing the numbers of coups. In fact, a few years ago, we were saying that we've seen the era of coups end. People were thinking that the use of coup would no longer be seen, that it wouldn't be accepted. And so that's this recent period where we've seen the return of the coup. It's very it's very disheartening given the progress that has been made. But I think the path for how you get back there is already apparent. We've already done it before, so we can do it again. It's not like you have to create something brand new here, but it's about reinforcing those norms. And there were very clear signals that coups would not be accepted, and that those members would be not recognized, and those individuals would be sanctioned. And we stopped doing that. Again, I think with this idea of expediency, the idea that it will somehow just be just as easy to let this coup happen and then transition from that point, rather than trying to deny the coup altogether. And so, one, I would just say, let's go back to stringently applying these norms about not recognizing coups. Um, but two, I would say, there needs to be a discussion about the role of militaries in politics, because in some cases we're not seeing clear coups, but we're seeing militaries just grow a lot more influential within a political party. And this is less so in West Africa, but in Zimbabwe, in Burundi, Algeria, Egypt, of course, Chad, militaries have grown increasingly influential in politics. And whether they themselves are officially ruling or they're just ruling from behind the scenes, they carry a lot of clout. And I think that's another thing that we need to push back on, and really moving forward with democratically elected civilian governments. And to review, what is the role of a military? A military is there to protect its citizens. That's the primary role of a military. A military is not there to govern. A military is not trained to govern. A military doesn't have the authority or the legitimacy to govern. Let's talk about how militaries could do a better job with the things they need to do. Now, there's an important role for the military. Security is an important goal for all citizens, and that helps to advance development. But we need to be clear about how that fits in within the broader governance. And again, having democratically elected civilian leaders creates accountability. So if you have accountability, then if the leader is doing something that the people don't want, they can protest. They can call for change. They can offer alternatives. There could be debate. There could be criticism. And you then legally find ways of changing things. If the military is the one who's calling the shots, there aren't those legal measures to make change. Mm-hmm. And so that's the important difference. And I think that's what we want to be reminding people about.
Good. So we have been seeing some countries like Malawi, like Botswana, those countries, they are doing very good in the democratic side if you look at it. But some countries has been having issue about how to establish democracy, especially in West Africa, most of the country. So in your knowledge, why most of African countries have problems to establish democracy?
Well, there are 54 different African countries, and so there are 54 answers to your question. I would remind your viewers that Africa has made a lot of progress for democracy from where we were in 1990s. Then over 40 of Africa's countries had one-party states, constitutionally, and so speaking up was prohibited. There was very little space for civil society. We've come a long way. There's been a lot of progress made today. There are very few countries where constitutionally there's just one-party states. And there's much more independent media, access to information, opportunity for civil society. Civil society is stronger. So we've made a lot of progress. I think the issue is, how do you sustain it? And I think, there are a number of things. I would focus again on this issue of checks and balances that, in the process of making progress on some of these civil liberties and political rights, we haven't seen enough progress in building institutions that create checks and balances on executives. The chief executives, the heads of state, retain a great deal of power over the courts, um, over the civil service, in some cases over the media, and in many cases over the legislature. I think for Africa to go the next step in improving democracy, we need to see those checks and balances reinforced. Election commissions, they need to be independent. There needs to be ways, and we need to have protections for journalists and others sharing information so that people can be informed and can make decisions.
Good.
Political parties, opposition parties should have space to offer alternative points of view. Those in power may not like that, but that's how you have a thriving democracy and allow people to express their differences openly and try to resolve it through these defined processes.
Okay, good,
Um,
good. So let's talk, let's me go back a little bit again in Guinea and Mali. Let's talk about those two countries a little bit. So so the military coup has been that happened in Mali, and then right now we have the one who has the power is the military, and then in Guinea is the same thing. So do you think that they will hand over power to the civilian?
well, I think they will if there's pressure on them. So let's remember, that both of these governments require recognition for them to operate. They don't have independent sources of revenue and income if they can't conduct transactions, financial transactions. And so I think, being clear about who controls the sovereign accounts of these countries is an important point of leverage to force these military juntas to give up power. If they believe that if they hold on and they just resist and eventually ECOWAS and the international community is going to recognize them, then that's what they're going to do. But if they feel that, they're just, that they don't have the resources, they're not going to have the political recognition and the financial resources to do anything, then they're going to have a lot more incentive to move on. And so I think just reinforcing that, and that has to be done regionally, domestically, and internationally. Then and there needs to be a clear sense that with the transition, with civilian-led governments, there's going to be a lot more investment, a lot more re-engagement in these countries. I think that is how you're going to bring about change. I think both coups need to be reversed. Certainly, Mali is further along. Assimi Goïta has very much clearly signaled he doesn't plan to give up power, and he wants to continue to hang on. In Guinea, there has been more signs that Doumbouya is open to change, mm-hmm. But I think in both cases you need to not compromise. You don't leave the door open for them to stay on. They are not the ones who should be controlling the transitions.
Good. So before we end this interview, would you like to add something?
No, I think though, Amadou, I would just highlight that this is an important time for West Africa, for Africa more generally. Democracy is under strain, and democracy it sounds simple, but democracy is a government by the people, and so the people are the ones who are going to have to speak up and be clear about their expectations. Autocracy continues when there is a sense that people don't care, and that these leaders can get away with it. And to the extent that people are involved, it raises awareness, it raises transparency, and it raises pressure. And I think that is that is how we're going to reverse this. And then I would just end by saying, democracy is not a one-time deal.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a single election. It's not a single event. Democracy is a process. And so people need to be involved and stay involved in government, and following up on government, even after a successful election, even when you have a democratic government in place. You have to stay engaged and continue to call for higher standards and upholding the norms and principles of democracy, and having that healthy, vibrant debate about constructive ways forward. Democracy succeeds when populations are involved.
Good.
And so I think that's the thing that we want to be coming back to here as we talk about some of these challenges that we have today.
Thank you so much for joining me this weekend on African Podcast TV.
It's my pleasure, Amadou. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you.